I'd like to welcome everybody to this evening's webinar. The purpose of putting on this event is so that we can have a look at the schools white paper that has recently been published, and also the SEND consultation. This is one of a number of events that the Down Syndrome Association is putting on, and lots of other organisations are also putting on webinars as well. So this is because it's potentially quite significant reform that is being proposed. So this evening we will have an opportunity to think about what does that mean for children and young people who have Down syndrome. So let me just move on. So just to introduce the session, the government schools white paper was published a few weeks ago, and there's also, alongside the white paper, there is also a SEND consultation as well. The Down Syndrome Association always wants to be providing clear, trustworthy information, particularly at a time when there is maybe a lot of media attention. There might be some mixed messages coming out. What's important to remember at this stage is that nothing has changed yet. So these are proposals. These are what the government is saying they would like to do, but nothing has changed yet. So we at the Down Syndrome Association have been in active discussion with senior officials at the Department for Education for several months now, and also we have been involved in some meetings with Minister Georgia Gould, who is leading this work as well. What we want to do this evening is give you the opportunity to hear some information from the DSA and also from other leading experts in the sector, and for you to have an opportunity to ask questions as well. The chat function is disabled this evening, mainly because quite a lot of people have booked onto the session, so we want to make sure that we can manage the questions and answers, and we're not looking at the questions and answers as well as chat. So if you have any questions for any of the speakers, or just generally about the reforms, please put those into the Q&A, and we will respond to those either during the session, or there is time that is allowed at the end after the presentations. So this evening, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome two, as I've said, leading experts in the sector. So Philippa Stobbs brings decades of national expertise in SEND policy and implementation. She previously worked for the Council for Disabled Children for many years, but tonight is speaking in an independent capacity. And also I'd like to welcome Linda Jordan, who has extensive experience in inclusion and post-16 education, who will also be able to give her deep insight into how policy translates into practice. And Linda is also a parent of a young lady. Her daughter has Down syndrome, so she's bringing lived experience to this conversation as well. So from the DSA's perspective, you'll be hearing from me. I'm the Policy and Parliamentary Lead, and my name is Sharon Smith. And also Gillian Bird, who's our Services Director, is here this evening too. Okay. So as I've said, the purpose of today really is to introduce the Schools White Paper, to talk to you about the SEND consultation proposals, to look at some of the implications for pupils who have Down syndrome, to draw your attention to some risks that we foresee in relation to existing rights and entitlements to support, and to answer your questions as well. We won't be able to cover absolutely everything this evening. The Schools White Paper and the SEND consultation document are hundreds and hundreds of pages, but we have spent quite a lot of time looking at them in depth, so we hope that we will be able to answer any questions you have. And if there are questions that remain unanswered, we will try and get those published as a sort of FAQ on our website as well. What's important for you to know is that these reforms that are being proposed, particularly through the SEND consultation proposals, are not just minor tweaks. They are structural and significant changes. They affect rights, they affect processes, funding, accountability, and also the inclusion of learners. So it's really important that your voice and your experiences can contribute to this conversation and the consultation. And we at the DSA are particularly keen to hear from you as well. So, very brief agenda. I'm going to start by introducing the white paper very quickly, just to give you some context. And also then I'm going to spend a little bit more time looking at some of the detail in the proposed changes to the SEND system. Then Philippa is going to talk around EHCPs, proposed changes to statutory provision, and Linda will be talking about inclusion, maybe some post-16 in there as well. And we'll look at then answering your questions at the end. We're wanting to give you a really clear and accessible overview of the reforms that are being proposed, and also looking at some of the opportunities that might bring, but also some of the risks as well. So the school's white paper and the SEND consultation were both published on the same day, but they are two separate documents. And on our website, later on in the presentation, there is a slide with a link to information on our website where you can basically find all of these documents. The school's white paper sets out the government's long-term plan for schools in England. And there are various reforms that are being proposed in terms of looking at attainment, looking at attendance, changing funding arrangements, particularly improving the education of disadvantaged pupils, increasing collaboration in terms of between education, health and social care, but also just in local areas as well. So between schools, looking at how can maybe special schools provide some outreach or support to mainstream schools where they've got some expertise. They're also looking at changing the admissions process to make that, they've described they want to make that fairer, and also looking at strengthening the school workforce in terms of their training, but also putting more support in place, particularly for mainstream schools. So this paper, the white paper, is setting out the government's aims and the direction of travel that they see for mainstream schools in particular and multi-academy trusts. And this is designed to work alongside the SEND reforms, and it's only the SEND consultation that basically is being consulted on. So the rest of the white paper, although there are some significant changes in there, they're not being consulted on. The part of this that is being consulted on is around the changes to education for those pupils who have special educational needs and disabilities. So I'm going to very, very quickly take you through some of the things that are in the school's white paper. But as I've said, these are things that are not being consulted on particularly. So they're expecting all state schools, so schools that are maintained, to join or form a school trust. They haven't given a deadline for when they're anticipating that will happen by. They're saying that local authorities who previously haven't been able to set up trusts or multi-academy trusts will now be able to do so. So whereas at the moment local authorities might have maintained schools that they look after, because all schools are expected to form a trust, they're saying that local authorities can form trusts from their maintained schools. And then they're going to introduce new standards for these trusts related to inclusion, value for money, community collaboration. And one of the things they've talked about introducing is annual parent forums. So all schools would have a parent forum at least once a year to hear from parents in the local area. They're looking to update the school's admissions code, as I've said, to make it fairer, and particularly, again, looking at disadvantaged students. They want to make sure that schools, if it is a school that is in an affluent area, that also pupils who are more disadvantaged are able to go to that school. And they're looking at more local responsibility and coordination of services and support, and increasing early intervention, so through sort of hubs that can help in the early years for children, and making sure that there is more access to support on the ground in local areas rather than having to wait or go through long processes and waiting lists. They're also looking to improve attendance in schools, and are refreshing guidance on behaviour. They're looking at developing a new evidence-based toolkit on behaviour and bullying. In relation to the curriculum, there is an increased focus on literacy and numeracy, and they are hoping that on average, children across England will leave secondary school with GCSEs at grade 5 or above. And then one of the other things that they're looking at is how they can monitor pupil movement. So if there's off-rolling, if there's schools that are basically encouraging their students to go elsewhere because maybe they are affecting the school's league table position. And then another area of focus is around belonging and relationships. So they're talking about introducing an annual survey of pupils' experiences in school and publishing a pupil engagement framework, looking at things such as relationships, motivation, belonging, safety. And also they're wanting to publish an enrichment framework, which covers things such as civic engagement, arts, culture, outdoor sports, physical activities. They're wanting to make sure, again, that all pupils have access to these opportunities and that it's not just those that are the most advantaged. So very much looking at how can they tackle issues around disadvantage for pupils, but this also would include pupils with special educational needs as well. And then the last thing that I've listed here is that they're looking to introduce some minimum expectations for home-to-school partnerships with families. So how can that relationship between schools and parents be improved? So this is the context within which the SEND reforms are going to be introduced. And what I'm going to go on to talk about now is that consultation and the bits that are being consulted on. Within the SEND consultation document, there are a number of proposals that they have set out. And even though they have set them out in the SEND consultation document, they're not necessarily consulting on all of them. So again, I will talk to that as I go through. So what they're wanting to do with this reform is to have more pupils educated in their local mainstream schools in mainstream classrooms. So there's a big push on mainstream inclusion. They are, as a result of this, they are changing or proposing changes to several aspects of how pupils who have special educational needs and disabilities are being supported. They're wanting to have more children and young people who are just able to be included because the support and the expertise is there and available to them, which I think is something that the Down Syndrome Association wouldn't argue against, but we have to look at obviously the detail. And as we said, you know, the devil's in the detail here. And what will this look like for pupils who have Down syndrome? So they're wanting to introduce some new tiered layers of support in mainstream, and they're introducing individual support plans. And I'm going to come on and talk about all of these things. Looking to make some changes to education, health and care plans. And this obviously is an area that is of significant interest to us and to probably all of you who are here this evening, given that most, if not all, pupils who have Down syndrome will have an education, health and care plan. They're looking at introducing new funding mechanisms, new accountability structures. They are also looking to change the SENDIS tribunal redress route in terms of the powers that the tribunal will have, and they are looking to put some additional restrictions on parental preference in terms of school. But again, I'll come on and talk about that. And then there's going to be a revised SEND code of practice and also Ofsted inspection criteria that are both there. They're going to be updated to reflect any legislative changes. Now, as I've said at the beginning of this session, these are just proposals for change. So although they are being set out in this consultation, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to happen, and it doesn't mean they're necessarily going to happen in the way that they're set out in the consultation document either. So the consultation itself has already been open, I think, for about 4 weeks. So we have about 8 weeks left to respond to it. And we would encourage all of you, and if you're members of affiliated groups as well, affiliated parent support groups, we'd encourage groups to respond to this. We basically need as many people as possible to respond to this consultation. I'm going to give you a link later on to a page on our website which has all of these consultation documents linked to it. But if you just search for Send Consultation and Department for Education in a search engine, you will also find that. So all of the consultation documents were published, and that included an easy read version, a BSL version, and there are online response forms on the DfE website. And the responses to this consultation should inform the final proposals that the government will then turn into a bill that they'll present in Parliament, and that bill will actually set out exactly how they want the law to change in terms of support for learners who are disabled and have special needs. So anybody can respond to this consultation, and as I've said, we'd really encourage you to do so. So that could be families, it could be children and young people who have Down syndrome if they're supported to do so. It could be people who are professionals, it could be organisations, sector experts, etc. So basically anybody can respond to this if they have an interest in it. So it is a public consultation, it's not final policy. We do still have the opportunity to influence what goes into that final legislation. The final decisions, therefore, will rest with MPs. So any new laws or changes to any existing legislation must pass through Parliament, which means that the MPs will scrutinise, they'll debate, they'll amend, and they'll vote on any legislative changes. Which means that if you have concerns about what I tell you tonight, then it will be really important for you to contact your MP. And as I've said, we are already speaking to some MPs, but we're planning on also doing an MP briefing during this consultation period too. So it is important that you have your voice heard and that MPs understand how you feel about some of the changes that are being proposed and the implications. What does that mean for you, your child, your family? So, as I've said, there is a greater focus on mainstream education for pupils. And that is an ambition that the Down Syndrome Association would welcome. We know that some pupils, many pupils who have Down syndrome can and do succeed in mainstream education. But at the moment, we also know that too often pupils are told that schools can't meet need, or that there isn't the teachers don't feel confident, or that there isn't any training that they've accessed, etc. So we would welcome this greater focus on mainstream education, recognising that for some families they will always be wanting to potentially choose specialist provision. So to support this, the government proposed that there'll be a development of some national inclusion standards based on evidence. Now, these national inclusion standards are going to be developed by what they've called an expert panel. And that expert panel hasn't yet been appointed. The government have announced today, or the DfE have announced today, that Tom Rees is going to be heading up, he's going to be co-chairing, should I say, the expert panel that will be looking at this. Tom Rees is Chief Executive, I think, of a multi-academy trust, and he is also the father of a young man who has Down syndrome. They're saying that mainstream schools must demonstrate inclusive practice, and the Ofsted inspection framework has already been updated to include inclusion as part of that, but it will be further updated to make sure that schools are inspected in a way so that they have to demonstrate inclusive practice. And they've also said that there will be a requirement for schools to publish an inclusion strategy, and there will be a greater focus on existing legislation, which is the Equality Act, and the duties that already exist on schools, such as making reasonable adjustments for disabled children. They're also looking to reform the specialist sector. They're saying that places in special schools will be only for those with the most complex needs. And I've put complex in speech marks there because at the moment there is no formal definition of what complex means. And those are the pupils who will have education, health and care plans. So they're basically wanting to restrict education, health and care plans and specialist provision to those who have what they see is the most complex needs. I'm going to come on and talk a little bit about that later on. They're suggesting that local special schools or alternative provision, so AP, settings might be able to provide outreach into those mainstream schools to share expertise. They've also already announced actually significant investment in wanting to increase inclusion bases. So at the moment we have resource provisions and we have units. They've got a new name of inclusion bases in mainstream settings, and they've said that at some point in the future, again I don't think there's a date for this, but every secondary school will have to have one of these inclusion bases. Now there's going to be two different types, one where pupils maybe just go in and out for some extra interventions and some support, but mainly are going to be in the mainstream classrooms, and then there will be others where it is almost like a specialist class attached to a mainstream school. They're also looking to significantly reform independent special schools, so those private schools, which some of them are run for profit, some of them are run by charities, and they're wanting to align the duties, the funding, the value for money with basically state-funded schools. So to remove some of that profit out of the system and to make sure that all school places are on a parity in terms of what the costs are for those. Talked earlier or just mentioned briefly that there's going to be new layers of support. At the moment we have got, if you have special educational needs, we've got SEND support, and then we have education, health and care plans. And what they're looking to do is introduce some new layers instead. And some of you may remember, depending on how old your child or young person is, prior to the 2014 reforms, we had School Action and School Action Plus. So this is reminiscent of that type of layers of support. So they're basically saying that universal will be a core offer that means that all pupils can be included in a mainstream school. So these are the things that will be around an inclusive school leadership, adaptive teaching, reasonable adjustments, and just a general inclusive culture within the school. And that's this base level of universal support. There will then be some pupils who will need school or college-led interventions. So this might be some curriculum adaptations, it might be some overlearning, some small group work, etc. And they will be at the level called targeted. Then we have targeted plus, which is where those pupils might need support, say from a speech and language therapist or an occupational therapist. And they're introducing a new support, which is called experts at hand, which I'm going to talk about on my next slide. But also these pupils might be the pupils then that will go and have some time in the inclusion bases as well. And then we have what they're calling the specialist layer. Now, this isn't necessarily that you have to be in specialist provision. So this is the specialist layer is those pupils who will have more complex needs, as we said, whatever that means, and they will have education, health and care plans, and they will have access to one or more specialist provision packages, which I'm also going to come on and talk about. And all of these pupils who have special educational needs, whether they're at targeted plus or specialist, will have an individual support plan that captures their day-to-day provision. And that plan will be written with the school. And there's also an expectation that, as I've said, that schools will participate and collaborate with other schools in the local area. So experts at hand is something new. This is part of what the government is wanting to introduce, and they're saying that there will be local multi-agency teams who are available to advise and support schools. And this could be education psychologists, specialist teachers, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, behaviour specialists, and it could also be outreach from some of those special schools or those alternative provision settings. Each local area, led by the local authority, will define the exact offer and how resources are going to be distributed. And the aim is that there will be quicker support without waiting for statutory assessment. So you won't need to apply for an education, health and care plan to get some input from a speech and language therapist, for example. And also the focus of these experts at hand teams is to be upskilling staff and also providing support at group level. So, for example, some group speech and language therapy sessions. As I've said, they're looking at increasing inclusion bases. These are small units that are attached to mainstream schools offering specialist places. Every secondary school would be expected to have an inclusion base, and this is to provide additional support. I think I've already talked to this, so I'm going to skip on to the next slide. So individual support plans, again, these are new. They're proposing that there will be a legal duty on schools to produce an individual support plan, an ISP, for every child who has special educational needs and disabilities, and this will be a digital record. Now, these ISPs will be developed by the setting, so whether it's early years setting, schools, or further education. And this is where the day-to-day provision is going to be specified. And I'm going to come back and talk about this when we come to talk about EHCPs, but this is a significant shift for those who have education, health and care plans currently. These individual support plans will be reviewed annually with the school. And again, this is a shift from annual reviews of education, health and care plans, which take place with the local authority and also the school. And if you have a complaint about the individual support plan, your route of redress will be through the school's complaints process. And if you exhaust that process and are still unhappy, you'll be able to escalate it to a panel which will have an independent SEND expert. So this could be, for example, a SENCO from another multi-academy trust. There will be other routes which will be judicial review against the school or a SEND disability discrimination claim, but you won't be able to take the content of your individual support plans to the SENDIS tribunal. Whereas at the moment, if you're not happy with an education, health and care plan content in section F, which is your special education provision, you can go and appeal that at tribunal. So that's changing. So there will be changes to education, health and care plans. And I think actually having looked at the detail of this, I don't think that within the new system that education, health and care plans are going to be anything like what we have today. I think they're going to share a name, and I'd be really interested to hear Philippa and Linda's views on this when they come to speak. But I think that actually what we call an education, health and care plan today will not be what we call one in the future. So they're going to be introducing some specialist provision packages, which I'm going to talk about on my next slide. And your threshold as to whether you can have an education, health and care needs assessment is going to be based on these packages. There will be a new education, health and care needs assessment process that will be designed. So in terms of how the needs assessment currently works, that is all going to change, but there is no detail about what that's going to look like in the consultation. As I've already said, every child who has special educational needs will have an individual support plan. And that's where the day-to-day support, that should say day-to-day support, so forgive my typo, that's basically where the day-to-day support will be included. At the moment, all provision that a child who has an EHCP has is included within the EHCP. So this is changing. Again, EHCPs are going to be digitised and standardised, which will allow them to be transferable if you move between local authority areas. And what they've also said is they're looking to introduce a fast track for some children under 5 who have complex needs, where it is identified, maybe even as early as birth, that they are going to need an education, health and care plan and that they may meet the criteria for these specialist provision packages. Now, we don't know at the moment if this would include children who have Down syndrome. We have been invited and are on a ministerial group around complex needs. So we are assuming from that the department and also the minister would would consider that some, at least, children who have Down syndrome would be considered within this category of complex needs, if not all. But we don't know for sure at the moment. And as we know, children who have Down syndrome have very, very different needs, and those needs can change over time as well. The other thing that they're going to be saying is that if you have an education, health and care plan, which will be based on these specialist provision packages that I'm going to talk about on the next slide, then they are going to provide you with a list of settings that will be able to deliver the provision that they have decided your child needs. Now, again, this will come to later on in the presentation, but it looks again as though there will be some reduced rights there in terms of being able to state your preference and get in a tribunal to actually name the setting that you're looking to have for your child, whereas at the moment a tribunal can do that. So I'll come on to that very quickly. So these specialist provision packages, these are going to be nationally determined packages of provision with those who have the most complex needs. Now, that at the moment is pretty much all we know. They're suggesting there'll be 7 packages, and these are going to be used pretty much as a commissioning tool. So local authorities will look at their data, they'll look at the local area, and they will commission settings to provide certain packages. Now, what they're saying is that children who have complex needs might well require support from one or more of these provision packages. And they're also saying that these packages will exist for both mainstream schools and special schools. But we don't know what these packages are going to look like, what's going to be in them. We do know that it is intended that, as I've said, they're going to be a commissioning tool, and there's likely to be some banding in there in terms of costs, because what they're wanting again is to have this more equitable provision across the country so that it's not a postcode lottery as to what support you're going to get. But as I've said, although you might be assessed and then your child is told, well, maybe these 3 packages you're going to get support from this one, and this one, the actual provision that your child has on a day-to-day basis is going to be set out in the individual support plan. What's also looking to change is that once that needs assessment has taken place and the local authority has said that yes, your child meets the criteria for one or more specialist provision packages, it's only at that point that the education, health and care plan will be written with the setting that your child is going to go to. So education healthcare plans are changing in terms of the content and what's in them, but there's not a lot of detail in the consultation about what this looks like. The other thing that they've said is that these EHCPs and specialist provision packages will only be reviewed at key transition points. So when you're moving from infant school to junior school, from junior school to secondary school, from secondary school to post-16. So unlike at the moment where your EHCP is reviewed annually, these specialist provision packages and your eligibility for that support will only be reviewed at these key transition points. So that's also a significant change. And what they're also saying is that the SENDIS tribunal is changing. So you can still go to SENDIS tribunal to appeal if you've asked for a needs assessment and the local authority says no, so you can go and appeal that decision. The tribunal will also be able to make binding decisions about the actual provision packages, because you might say, well, I think my child meets the criteria for this package, and then the tribunal will be able to say yes or no on that. But what's changing is that local authorities are going to then give you a list of schools that you can choose from that can meet the needs of your child, and also will have those commissioned specialist provision packages for your child. And you won't be able to get a binding decision from the tribunal if you appeal that. So if the local authority gives you a list of schools and you think, actually, I don't want my child to go to any of those, I want them to go to school X, the local authority disagrees, you go to tribunal. The tribunal will only be able to tell the local authority to go back and reconsider its decision. They won't be able to name school X and give that binding decision. So that is a significant reduction in rights from what we have now in terms of the redress available. There's also proposed changes to when local authorities have the right to decline placements. So at the moment, there is very long-standing criteria about when a local authority can say no to a particular school, but they're expanding that. So now if a school is full, or if the local authority says that there are financial reasons for not naming a school, then that will be taken into consideration. So there are significant changes around routes of redress and accountability there. Now they're proposing that there'll be a phased transition. So what they've said is every child who has a special school place in September 2029 will be able to stay in a special school until they finish their education. So it's not till September 29 that any of these assessments will start under this new system, of course, if it passes through legislation. So the first cohort at their key stage transition, so primary, secondary, and post 16, will be assessed, excuse me, under the new system. And then September 2030, these will be those first people will be getting these new style EHCPs, whatever they look like, with the specialist provision packages and an individual support plan. And what they're saying then is that until at least September 2030, existing EHCPs and protections remain, and no child will be asked to leave a special school because of these reforms. And this phased transition is going to be overseen by the Children's Commissioner. So as I've said already, these existing rights remain currently. This is not something that's changing immediately. The Children and Families Act, the Children Act, the Equality Act, the SEND Code of Practice all remain in force, and local authorities and schools must still meet existing legal duties. And if you're having any issues where local authorities or schools are telling you differently, please contact us and we will try to help you. We've got a helpline that you can contact at any time. So these reforms are significant. They're going to impact children and young people who have Down syndrome. It's clear that there are rights-based protections that exist at the moment that are going to be weakened, but nothing has changed yet. We are going to continue advocating for children and young people who have Down syndrome. We're already engaging with the Department for Education and also ministers during and beyond the consultation period. We've put a page on our website that is about the school's white paper. So if you go to our website, if you can't find it, put school's white paper in the search and you should find that. We've also published a couple of guides to help you support people who have learning disabilities, but also parents, carers, professionals to respond to policy consultations. They're also on our website. And we have further events to help you understand more about what is happening, but also to support you to respond to the consultation as well. We have got the opportunity to run 3 focus groups with representatives from the Department for Education to discuss aspects of the reforms. So we've got one about complex needs and specialist provision packages, one about the experts at hand service and individual support plans, and one about accountability and redress in the new system. All of these events and these focus groups are on the page that I mentioned previously, so please do sign up if you want to be involved with those. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and stop talking and hand over to Philippa, who I'm absolutely delighted to welcome. So Philippa, over to you. Really want to hear your thoughts on what's being proposed.
Thanks, Sharon. And I'm going to share my screen because I have got some slightly odd slides with bits of animation in them, and so I need to be moving them on as I speak. I'm just going to see if I can go back one. There we go. Sharon, you've set out very clearly the arrangements that are set in the both in the school's white paper and in the SEN and disability reform consultation document. So what I'm going to do is some of what's on my slides may repeat what you've said already. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip through some of what I say, but of course you will have the slides because the session has been recorded. You will have the slides, so hopefully that won't be a problem for people. If I scamper through some of the slides a bit sharpish, that's because some of it is repeating what you've said. I just want to start with a point which I think it makes this consultation, the publication of the white paper and the SEN and disability reform consultation document, rather more problematic for people. The white paper and the consultation document were published on February the 23rd. Why is that significant? Well, it's about 6.5 years on from when we first thought we were going to get some reforms to the SEN and disability arrangements. And so it was late 2019 when we were expecting the reforms to be published and to have an extended consultation period on them. Then, of course, we know what happened in 2020. COVID struck, and then we had a government consultation published in 2022 and an improvement plan published a year later. The difficulty is that over that period, children's outcomes have deteriorated. More children have been excluded and suspended. More children have absented themselves from school. I'm thinking in particular for children with SEN and disabilities. And the gap between them and their peers has widened. So even as after COVID, some of the indicators for children in general have improved. For example, on some of the latest absence data, exclusions, suspensions, some of those indicators have started to improve for the generality of children and young people. They have not for children with SEN and disabilities. And I think so over this 6.5 year period when we're expecting changes that would help to improve outcomes, we've actually seen some improvement for the general population, but not for the group that we're focused on tonight. So I think that's a problem. The fact that we haven't improved outcomes for children and young people with SEN and disabilities means that parents have had a harder and harder time. They've got more anxious, they've got more angry. Local authorities have gone further and deeper into debt. And in general, we are not in such a good place as we were even 6.5 years ago. Well, you might expect that things might have changed and improved in that time. I want to go back to the definition of special educational needs because I want to spend most of my time thinking about the difference between what the provision is that we make generally available and the things that we do for individual children that are additional or different. So there are important ways in which we have a relative definition of special educational needs. So in the definition, which is in the Children and Families Act, and I've seen no indication that there's an intention to change that definition, we compare one child with other children. So one child is compared to the extent that they have a greater difficulty in learning than their peers, then they may need special educational provision. And special educational provision, in turn, is compared with provision that is generally available. So we compare one child with other children, and we compare the provision for individual children with the provision that is generally available. So if the provision that is made generally available improves, then fewer children need that additional or different provision. And as that generally available provision diminishes, more children need additional or different provision. I've got an image which I hope will be helpful. So this is the seaside with those groins of different heights sticking up above the water to a different extent. Here's the tide coming in, and you'll see that in this part of the image, all those individual posts, if you like, our individual children are above the height of the tide. But as that tide improves, more of those children and young people having their needs met from this generally available provision. And if it improves still further, we can see that we need to intervene for fewer children and make that additional or different provision. And as the tide diminishes, we need to intervene for more children. And my feeling is, oh, here come the seagulls. Yes, watch out. They will nick your ice cream. My grandchildren experienced this just the other day. Very, very upsetting, but there are the seagulls. So the point that I'm making is that if we have better quality provision generally available, we need to intervene less. This might apply to the quality of the curriculum, the quality of teacher training, might apply to funding. It applies to accountability, the Ofsted framework, the extent to which that is actually checking the quality of the provision for all children. And here is the generally available provision, if you like, and here above the tide is the additional to or different from provision. I just want to refer to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, because the government documentation says that their definition of inclusion is guided by the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that we have a similar kind of equation between what the UN CRPD calls universal design and the designs that mean that we have less need to intervene individually, if you like, or less need to make those reasonable accommodations for individual children. So the better the quality of the universal design, the less we need to make those reasonable accommodations for individual children. Now, in the UK, obviously we have reasonable adjustments set out in the Equality Act, and any universal design that improves the overall design of the systems to include the full range of children, that reduces the need to make reasonable adjustments. But that duty doesn't go away. We still have to make reasonable adjustments. But it's the same kind of relationship between universal design and reasonable accommodation as I've talked about in relation to the definition of special educational needs and that generally available and additional to and different from. So these are two ways of looking at the height of the tide. Now, the first question I want to think about is what can help to raise the tide, increase the generally available provision, and improve the universal design? And I think this is important because I think we need to think about why we've had such a massive increase in the number of EHC plans that we've issued since the increase started in about 2015, 2016, very significant increase, and it continues to rise. My argument is that the tide, the quality of the provision that we've been making, the level of the tide has diminished, and that therefore we need to look for those things that are going to raise the tide, improve the quality of the provision. And there are a lot of things in the school's white paper that are very helpful in this respect. And because I'm going to be quite critical of the proposals specifically in the consultation document, I want to make it very clear that there are a lot of things we need to encourage the government to do and improve that don't negate the challenges that I see with the specific arrangements around the statutory decision-making processes that where the changes are proposed in the SEN disability reform document. So let's just think about what some of those things are. And I've called this the Schools White Paper Plus bit that may help to raise the tide, or where we need to ask the question about whether it does, because some of these things the government's already started to do. So, for example, the curriculum. The changes to the curriculum, which will start in 2028, are very much focused on improving the curriculum for all, and with breadth and enrichment of the curriculum as well. Now, there are a lot of questions then that we need to pursue around some of these things that can help to raise the tide, the quality of the provision we make generally available. And my question on the curriculum is that going to be followed through? That is the intention of the design of the new curriculum. But as it progresses, is that curriculum going to be a curriculum for all children? Or is it actually going to have the very heavy content that we had in the 2014 curriculum, which has actually made it much more difficult for teachers to teach inclusively? Do our assessment systems reflect the progress of all children? Well, they don't at the moment, but there are proposals to change some of the measures we have at the end of secondary school to improve the range of achievements that are then acknowledged and are measured in relation to progress. Do those proposals go far enough? Will we be able to see that the progress that schools have made with children who've come in with significantly below the levels of expected at the end of Key Stage 2? So again, there are changes to teacher training which have already been implemented, but do those actually move too swiftly to additional or different provision, what's called adaptive teaching? And do we build in enough curriculum for all into our subject teacher teaching? So do trainee teachers of maths, do they get enough thinking time? Do they get enough planning time in their training? Do they get enough practice in the ways in which we need to develop the curriculum so that it includes all children? And in the Schools White Paper, there's quite a lot about belonging, which is very much focused on making schools more welcoming for children. It's to address the attendance challenges we have at the moment. And it focuses on belonging and relational approaches. But are these strongly enough about welcoming all children? And what about some of those schools that still have zero tolerance policies, which don't allow for the making of reasonable adjustments for children who may need recognition of their special educational need or their disability in order to be accommodated? In terms of the funding, are we moving enough funding to right to the front line to teachers in schools to enable them to respond to the needs of a wider range of children? And does the buildings program that we have at the minute facilitate that? Or are we actually providing something that is going to be more segregationist with some of the bases that are proposed in schools? How can we be confident that those are going to be used inclusively? Then, in terms of accountability, the new Ofsted framework is very significantly more focused on inclusion. Is that going to work to the benefit of children with SEN and disabilities? Are we confident that that's how that is playing out? There is less about values and ethos. And so I have a question about how are hearts and minds going to be changed, where schools and teachers have not been welcoming children with a wide range of special educational needs and disabilities. How are we going to change their hearts and minds to make schools more welcoming? Will those belonging approaches, will those help? They may do. Will they help enough? And then we still have some problems about admissions policies which sit outside the strictly structural, or if you like, statutory arrangements. It's that preliminary visit to a school where we know from research carried out by the Children's Commissioner that many parents are discouraged from pursuing admission to that particular school because there's a better school down the road. There's a very good Senko who will understand your child. So, how do we take all of this into account? My point is, there is some stuff here that we need to welcome and push further. And in looking at the statutory bits, I don't want to lose sight of this because these are the things that can actually make a difference to children in our schools. The statutory bits are process issues which secure entitlement, yes, but these are the things that are really going to make the difference. So please, when you're responding to the consultation document, there are probably not specific questions on all of these things, but you have a wonderful question 39 where it asks if you have anything further to say. So it's really important to pick up these things. These, I'm so persuaded that these are the things that are really going to make a difference to your child in the future and your children's successors in the future. So it's really important that we pursue these things, which can really change the way children are taught and the way they learn in our schools. So then for me, there then is a test about some of the proposals that Sharon has outlined. Will these national inclusion standards, articulated by the national experts and all the continual professional development that is proposed, will those improve the quality provision in our schools? It's very clear national inclusion standards are going to be based on a very clear evidence base. So promoting approaches that are evidence-based, which is great, but they are going to be, in effect, they are going to be statutory because they will be set out in the code of practice, which will be a new code of practice, and schools must have regard to the code of practice. So in effect, it would make these national inclusion standards statutory. That's a problem for me because we have a very slim evidence base at the moment. And I really hope that the national inclusion standards will really accelerate the research and the evidence for what can really improve children's learning and progress. But if they are only set out in the code of practice might not get revised for another 10 years. That's not good enough. So I would very much prefer to see those national inclusion standards as advisory and updated regularly and feeding into that continual professional development. The proposals to change our four broad areas of need into five areas of development. So my question would be, will this help teachers? Will this speak the language of teachers in classrooms that can help them to think about the needs that children are presenting in front of them? And Sharon's talked about that universal targeted and targeted plus system with experts at hand to help with the targeted plus bit. Do we have a sufficiently robust workforce plan for the future to make sure we have got those specialist teachers as well as occupational therapists and speech and language therapists, which the consultation document talks about, yes, but will we have those specialist teachers as well who can be there? And do we have a plan about how we're going to have enough of those teachers? Because one of the things that's reduced the tide over the last 10 to 15 years has been the reduction in the support services available to work with schools. And it was never intended that schools would be able to respond to the needs of every child on their own. It was always expected, right back to Warnock, it was always expected that there would be supplementary skills and expertise, that we shouldn't be expecting schools to be able to respond to the needs of every single child who might cross their doorstep. Then I think what I would like to suggest is, because I don't want to go on for too long on this, but for each of the proposals that Sharon has talked about, we need to think, is the proposal, for example, the proposal to make individual support plans statutory, will that enhance the capacity of schools to work collaboratively and creatively with parents? I worry that having a statutory plan in schools may lead to the same adversarial relationships that we tend to get when we move towards an EHCP at the minute. That's where you get to the statutory stages. I worry that that will stifle the really creative conversations that need to take place between schools and parents and children, young people themselves, which is how you can come up with some fantastic bits of provision, fantastic reasonable adjustments that can really make a difference for children and can enable them to access learning readily. So I worry a bit about making those plans statutory and the clear intention to improve the complaints procedures at school and college level. So, are we actually setting parents and teachers up to be in conflict with each other rather than creating that conversational area where we can get those creative ideas? And then
Sorry to interrupt. You've got 2 or 3 more minutes because I need
yes,
to pass
so
on
I
to
need to
Linda.
move on because this is all about the level of the tide. So there are also some targets and some ambitions set out, and would encourage you to look at those and think about whether those do enough for children with special educational needs and disabilities. And there is little reference to the Equality Act duties in the documentation, and there is very minimal reference to ordinarily available provision, which local authorities are required to publish and develop with parents, children, young people, and other agencies locally. And that, again, is where you can get good conversations going. So we need to think about the role of those conversations in creating better provision in schools and in classrooms. So, will these proposals raise the level of the tide, is really what I'm saying. Then I want to look at the implications on the other side of the tide for that decision-making process and for the changes in the tribunal arrangements and the changes in the level of the tide where we move into thinking about an education, health and care needs assessment and plan. So the level of the tide will be determined for what exists above the tide will be determined through these specialist provision packages. I think that is deeply problematic. First of all, there is a document associated with the consultation. It's called the specialist provision packages. And what's set out in those doesn't look to me like provision at all. It looks like a completely undefined set of expectations around complex needs without any definition. And the bits of provision that are mentioned in these packages, I don't think make sense or tie in anything like in anything like the way that they need to. So the bit that sits under the tide is the national inclusion standards, which I've talked about. And then the line that defines the difference between the two there in the middle. Now, the concern for me is that it's whether the child meets the new threshold for specialist provision, and they are for children and young people with the most complex needs. Now, that sits around the definition of the line, which says to me that that line is actually not touching the line which is defined by what sits under the tide. So what we risk a gap between what we can expect schools to make generally available, where we can expect the extent of the universal design, and where children meet the threshold for the specialist provision. And that, I think, is the underlying problem. And if we then look at the tribunal rights in relation to that, again, we've got a problem about the nature of the provision to be made and how that's defined. And Sharon has said that the independent panel will oversee the national inclusion standards and the specialist provision packages, but the threshold for those packages is the threshold for an EHCP. And the decision to be made is whether a child or young person should be on one of those packages, and if so, which one. That's a decision made by the local authority. The slight problem for me is that there is at the same time a feeling that we should not be allowing remote administrative folk to be determining the provision for individual children. There is a recognition in other parts of the paperwork that, for example, reliance on diagnosis may hide the nuance and individual difference in barriers to learning and participation. So there is a recognition elsewhere of the individuality of children's needs and the impact of those needs on learning. And a quote from Bridget Philipson, our Secretary of State, the other day: so mums and dads are fed up with the faceless, soulless system that governs what their child gets and how. So that doesn't seem to square for me with decisions about these specialist packages, which are going to set out exactly what interventions, resources, and standards are required. And they'll be based on national evidence-based guidelines, but they will not, there is a suggestion they will take account of local variation, but that doesn't seem to be written into these packages. So I'm very concerned. And also, there's a lot of reference to the experts and parents who'll be involved. Where's the practical discussion with teachers about what's possible and practical in classrooms? And if they're not involved in helping to shape those packages, then again, we're not setting up a system that is going to be workable.
We're going to have to probably hand over to Linda now, Philippa.
Yes, let me just,
Yeah, very
literally,
quickly.
I will just flick through this in order just to get
Thank
to
you.
the end of this. Please, for each proposal, will this improve outcomes for children and young people? And are the right people involved in the discussion? Have in mind what we can do to improve the generally available, what needs to be set out in the additional to or different from, and think about the line between the two. Thank you so much, and apologies if I've rather rattled through. It's in order to try and explain the principles of an approach that you might be able to adopt.
Thank you so much. We really, really value your insight. And I think certainly one of the things that is concerning the DSA is around these specialist provision packages and the fact that that will be firstly determined by a national panel of experts, as you've discussed, but also that that can change without any legislative change as well. So in terms of the criteria, so and we're not yet sure where children who have Down syndrome fit into that. I'm going to share Linda's slides for her, which I'm going to just quickly do now. And then Linda, let me know when you want me to move on.
Yeah.
So I'm delighted to welcome Linda Jordan to speak next.
Hi, everybody. Sharon, do we still want to keep some time for people to deal with the questions? Because there are a
Yes,
few.
if we can. There's a
I'll
few
try.
in the chat, but yes, I mean,
I'll,
we also want to hear your expertise as well.
yeah, I'll try and whiz through because I think what you've already heard from Sharon and Philippa is amazing. And been sitting here captivated because there were such clear and fantastic presentations. So I haven't got much to add really, but I thought I'd just highlight something about the whole post-16 and preparing for adulthood agenda. So I'm a teacher by profession, and I had the privilege of teaching a whole range of children, and I was really lucky to work in inclusive schools in the 80s and 90s, and also, as Sharon said, I got a daughter with Down syndrome who's 43, and she went through her local nursery, mainstream, primary, secondary and college from 3 to 20, and she was a perfect example of Philippa talking about ordinarily available and how it can get to the point when very few children actually need additional support. And she had that experience. She didn't ever have one-to-one support, and her schools embedded 99% of the support that she and other children needed. And so that was a fantastic example, because that is exactly, I know, is possible. And I'm just dreaming for the day that we can go back to that level of ordinarily available provision, meeting the majority of children's needs. So what I've been doing for the last 15 years is working on the whole preparing for adulthood agenda. So for those of you familiar with the Code of Practice that came in with the 2014 legislation, preparing for adulthood is a major theme all of the way through the Code of Practice. And it became an important theme because by 2014, it had been made very obvious through all sorts of research and programs of work that children were not being supported well enough to have a great life when they leave education. And working with 400 young people across the country between 2008 and 2011, myself and colleagues worked with those young people, 400 young people, to ask them what their dreams and aspirations are for the future, and whether what the support they were getting at that time met those aspirations. The young people were between 14 and 25. 99% of them were in special schools, and we spent 3 years working with them. So we got a huge body of evidence about what young people really wanted to talk about. And the themes were the same in every site that we worked in, and the messages were very consistent. And what young people told us, that they wanted choice and control in their lives. They wanted to have the same as everybody else. They wanted to be included at school and out of school. The most important thing for them were their friends and their relationships. They told us that they knew that people like them were not expected to work, to have relationships, to live with their girlfriends and boyfriends, to get married, to have ordinary lives, to have jobs, and so on and so forth. They wanted to talk about sexual relationships as well, which is always quite difficult, not only for parents but for the system. But they knew that and expressed that quite a lot. So that evidence base formed part of the legislation and the Code of Practice, because that work became preparing for adulthood and the themes all the way through the Code of Practice. And it is a very strong set of requirements and things that people are supposed to be doing. Next slide, Sharon. So I was obviously very, very disappointed when I read the Code of Practice, the white paper, that there is virtually nothing about preparing for adulthood and very little about post-16. Although in several places it sort of makes a sort of mention of post-16, but there is, and it says that this all applies to colleges, but there's not really anything that you would call detail. So we've asked the DfE people that we work with, the people that commission our work from DfE, and their answer is, well, it wasn't needed to be included because the Children and Families Act 2014 is still the law. So preparing for adulthood, which is embedded throughout the Code of Practice, is still the guidance that should be followed. And that the white paper is proposing a lot of changes to the whole school sector, but the proposals around special education needs and disabilities are being consulted on. And so at the moment, everybody should still continue to be implementing the requirements around preparing for adulthood. My concern and our concern at NDTi, and I think a lot of people's concern, is that with all the attention that will be being given to the white paper and the changes, that people in local authorities may not be able to give the priority to preparing for adulthood that they are giving at the moment. So the importance of preparing for adulthood is really important because it emphasises that most of what Sharon and certainly the stuff that Philippa has been talking about, what preparing for adulthood brought into the system was that knowledge that children and young people do want ordinary lives, which means that the system has to not only focus on giving them a really high quality education, but also supporting them around employment, around friends, relationships and community. We know that many children, including children with Down syndrome, really want friends. It's such an important part of their aspirations for now and in the future, but because of some of the barriers they face, mainly in the attitudes of society and the attitudes of many people around them, they aren't really supported in order to have friendships. And the ethos in our schools and in many other places, but particularly in schools, and I think that's got much worse over the last 14 years, is really not to really embed thinking about friendships and relationships, which is probably why we have so many children out of school, so many children excluded, and so many children without a school place, or in special schools when that's not really what they or their families wanted. So, you know, it's disappointing that there's not that much. There's a little bit, as Philippa said, around schools needing to be much more focusing on relationships. But at the moment, it's not enough. And we know that children with Down syndrome and other children with special needs really need a lot of support around friendships and relationships. And more importantly, schools need to have a lot more focus on their ethos and what they do around social inclusion and developing circles of friends and all of those really positive strategies that can really support children. So, you know, I think the rest has been said. The focus on GCSEs is really worrying because we know that all sorts of children, loads of children really need to have alternative accreditation, different kinds of accreditation, but that can still happen being in mainstream classes. You don't have to have being in a separate place in order to do alternative accreditation. One of the good things in the white paper, and it does say that every child should have a planned destination before they leave school. So, you know, hopefully that will be helpful to children with special needs. I'm trying to rush. Next slide, Sharon. So I do really want you to think hard about, you know, when you're doing your responses or when you're having opportunities to speak to people about the reforms. I think it's really important that we really focus on what is meant by complex needs. It is a category that isn't official and it is used very carelessly. I hear people talking about children having complex needs when the children they're talking about clearly have quite ordinary needs. I don't like the word myself. As a teacher for 20 years, and as you know, being involved in the SEND system for over 40 years, getting on for 45 years, I've only ever been involved with 2 young people that I felt had complex needs, because for me, complex needs means needs that are not understood and we don't know what kind of support to put in. And I think, you know, it's not a helpful need, because a helpful word, and I think we've got to really focus the DfE's mind on, you know, why are we using this word and what does it mean? The Minister, Georgia Gould, was asked last week at a meeting that I wasn't at, but it was a London summit around special educational needs, and apparently she was quite taken aback, and she said, well, it was children whose needs cannot normally be in a mainstream school, which we found, you know, we think is quite unhelpful. So there's a lot of confusion about complex needs. There's a lot of confusion about which children the DfE really envisage being included, because the white paper says all sorts of things that are quite contradictory. So there are quite a lot of statements that say that every child should be included in our schools, but it also goes on to say that special schools will be for the most complex children. And as Sharon's already said, it's very, very worrying that parental choice seems to be further eroded. Parents' rights, young people's rights seem to be further eroded. Next one. Just a very quick word on inclusion basis. Sharon has already explained these, but I think what's concerning here is that there's a big focus on inclusion, but for those children that are going to get targeted support, they may get this through their support base, which is a support base that the school would have set up. But for children who have got higher needs and are described as needing specialist support, their support is likely to be delivered through a specialist base if they're in a mainstream school. But in specialist bases, what the white paper is saying and what the same consultation documents is saying is that some of those children may eventually be able to move into mainstream classes. So even though although they're called inclusion bases, the specialist bases, it explicitly says that many of the children won't be moving into mainstream classes. So that's quite a worry. Next slide. So just leave you with some big questions. What do we mean by complex? I think we've all said that. We need to really ask these questions about the right to express a preference for a local mainstream school and to be included in mainstream classes. That does seem to be being eroded. Does adapted teaching mean being in a separate room? It feels to me that it does. But as a teacher and a mother who've experienced proper inclusion, differentiated teaching can be an amazing thing if teachers have got the skills to do it, which is when you include everybody in the same curriculum, but your pedagogy, the way that you teach, is differentiated to meet the needs of all of the children. I'm worried about whether the training that is going to be delivered to mainstream schools is going to actually include children with high support needs. Is it going to include what teachers would need to support children with Down syndrome, or is it going to be much more general teaching? That's really a big question that we need to ask. And finally, I think as parents and family members of people with Down syndrome, we really need to emphasize the importance of friendships and social inclusion, because I think many children with Down syndrome really are brilliant at social relationships, and they really want friends, but sometimes they do need support, and I think that support has got to be understood by mainstream schools. Yeah, so I leave you with that, and this is all extremely relevant to post-16 because these issues are relevant for the early years through to post-16, and the better support children get at school to be included, supported, to have a voice, to be confident, means that their post-16 experience is going to be much better. It's a bit of a rattle through, but I'll stop there because at least we can have 5 minutes of answering some of the questions that are in the chat.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Jill, can I hand over to you to sort of manage the Q&A? I've answered a couple of questions by typing responses in, but I thought some of these we could, I don't know, Jill, if you want to read them out or summarise them, and then we can have
the first one, I won't be able to summarise. That was fantastic, all of you. So the first one is several questions. Are children with Down syndrome likely to be automatically labelled as complex and also get an EHCP? If so, will that mean there's a risk they'll be pushed into special schools, or will parents be able to refuse and insist on a mainstream placement? There's a bit to follow that, which is, would the local authority have the power to only provide a list of special schools to choose from? Sharon, you said you'd like
I can
to
answer some of this. Yes, I can answer some of this because I've been in today actually a meeting around complex needs. The minister, so Minister Georgia Gould has got a ministerial group about complex needs that we've been invited to. So I think there is some level of assumption that children who have Down syndrome are being seen within that complex category as a result. But I was also at an all-party parliamentary group meeting where Georgia Gould was answering questions just last week as well. So I know some of at least what their thinking is on this. I've asked several questions about this. In fact, we've been talking to the Department for Education specifically about this risk. I would say probably for about 3 months now, because it's something that even through the previous rumours in the media, we were particularly concerned about. The unintended consequences of labelling children as being complex, which means that mainstream schools can say they're too complex to come to this school unless they're in an inclusion base, which Linda has just been referring to. So Georgia Gould has said that the presumption for the right of mainstream education will still exist, and that there will be specialist provision packages that are put in place for children who want to have mainstream education. And that doesn't just mean those who are in inclusion bases. And I've got that in writing from someone in the DFE as well, because that was a question I asked them after I saw a social media post a couple of weeks ago. However, what I would say is what is in writing and what happens in practice may well be very different. So I think there is a significant risk that learners who have Down syndrome will be seen as too complex to be included in mainstream schools. Or that if they want mainstream settings, that it will be that they're encouraged to be in those inclusion bases. What we don't know at the moment is what rights parents will have to say they don't want their child to be in an inclusion base. That's not clear. That might be something you want to include in your response, that there needs to be that within any changes to legislation. So that parents can say, actually, no, I want my child in a mainstream classroom and to be taught in a mainstream classroom the majority of the time. In terms of the local authority having the power to provide only a list of special schools to choose from, again, this isn't necessarily clear. What it says in the proposals is that local authorities will provide a list of schools that can deliver the specialist provision package that the child has been assessed as needing. So you will still have a right to say, well, actually, I don't want that setting. I want somewhere else.
Yeah.
And then you will be able to go to tribunal. But as I've said, there's reduced in terms of what the tribunal can then rule on. They can only ask the local authority to go back and reconsider. So there's a lot of people talking about you could end up in a bit of a doom loop where you go back, they reconsider, then you appeal, and then they reconsider, etc. And because of the way that they're suggesting it, you don't start to have an EHCP and you don't write the EHCP until the setting is agreed, because the EHCP is now going to be written by the setting rather than by the local authority. So I think there's a lot of risks and a lot of dangers here. I don't know, Philippa, Linda, if you've got anything to add to that.
So that's excellent. I did wonder
Yes.
if there was time to pick up the point about assessment, which was raised on Samantha's iPhone. Maybe Samantha using it, but it may not be, but it's Samantha's iPhone. Would that be okay just to put in a quick point about that? Because there is actually another consultation running at the same time as the SEND reforms consultation, which is about assessment. And obviously, the main focus, as you rightly identify, Samantha, is about GCSEs. But this is an opportunity to try and secure a different approach to the recognition of the achievements of all children when they leave school. I think if we could have some kind of framework, certificate of school leaving, and in that you could have, obviously, a lot of kids are going to have GCSEs, but we could also recognise in that document some of the other achievements that they've made over their school career. But in this consultation, there are specific proposals about widening the basket of GCSEs that can be included in the Attainment 8 measure. and there are some changes proposed, some exploration of some changes proposed around the progress measures. Obviously, the progress measures are the really, really important ones for us, because if a child's come through primary and has finished up behind where their peers are, nonetheless, when they go to secondary school, we want them and their school to be able to celebrate the progress that has been made. So do consider contributing to that consultation as well. And Sharon, I guess it would be possible perhaps to provide a link to that, because I think it's a slightly shorter period of consultation for that
I
consultation.
think it is shorter one, absolutely.
Yes,
Yes, and we can add that onto the school's white paper page as well. And
perfect.
just to reassure everybody, the DSA has that also on our list of consultations to be responding to in the coming weeks. So.
I think if I can, Samantha's question about the danger of putting children with complex needs together, it's absolutely right. I mean, you know, I'm so passionate about the need of children to be together, and I've just got so much of experience that leads me to believe that it is actually wrong to put children together just because they've all got needs. You know, first of all, young children copy, and they need to be with children that have got good language and are conforming to sort of the usual development, because they need to be in environments where they can see what other people are doing, and they really do copy. My daughter learned so much from her peers. Like, you know, I just have such a passionate belief that children need to be together from the beginning, and the early years are critical. But you can include children, and I think we've got to really campaign that this is possible. You know, as a teacher, both from special and mainstream, it is much better for everybody to have one or two children with high, you know, I use the word high needs, meeting most children with Down syndrome. To have a couple of children with really high needs in a room of 30 is much easier than having 10 children all with different kinds of disabilities and educational needs. Because if you're in a mainstream class, you've got the framework, the curriculum framework, and then you can think about the creative ways you're going to meet everyone's needs. And those children just benefit from that approach, and that's got to be our aim. It is that quality, Philippa, that you were talking about.
And your point, Linda, about social inclusion and the importance of encouraging children around relationships is so important. I read some research the other day about the social isolation experienced by disabled adults. And what was rather shocking, this was part of one of those big longitudinal studies. So because of the data over many years, the researchers could track that experience of social isolation in adulthood back to experiences of social isolation as a child.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
the importance of it is absolutely massive.
It's lifelong, isn't it? And you know,
Yes.
we're getting increasing numbers of young people, not even, you know, including children without learning disabilities or any normally additional needs, who are now suffering from social isolation and having difficulties with social relationships. And I think it's because what they say is that they weren't supported at school. You know, if they had any sort of challenges, they were on the sort of punishment route rather than the support route. There's one here that's about post-16. Bernadette, just very quickly, there is a separate white paper that was published in October that is about post-16, and it's one of the reasons or excuses that I've been given as to why the white paper doesn't say very much about post-16. It's got lots of great stuff in it. It does talk about, you know, better pathways and everything, but it's very, very unspecific. It's very general at the moment. And again, you know, we're waiting to hear more about the detail. I could say a lot more about that, but you're right to ask it. And I think, you know, you can even ask those sort of questions in the consultation.
Don't forget question 39.
Yes.
Anything further?
Absolutely. And also what I would say is we have got, as I've mentioned very, very briefly earlier on in the presentation, we've got three online sessions that Claire Burton, who is the director of Send an AP, is coming along to, so that she can listen directly to families to hear your concerns, to hear your questions, to hear what's important to you. So there is an opportunity for you to sign up for those. What we've done with those, because we're going to have limited numbers for those particular events, is that we're asking people to submit an expression of interest, mainly because we want diversity in terms of experiences, age of children, types of education, etc. So we want to get that real sort of diverse picture. But there are still spaces, as in there are 20 places per session, and I haven't yet had 20 people say they want to come. So if you're interested in those, Bernadette, I know you have my email address. Please contact me, or it is on that white paper page. We really want the DfE to have the opportunity to hear how these proposals have landed with parents, how they relate to real life experience, and what issues or opportunities we see within the proposals that have been presented in relation to people who have Down syndrome. And I think we feel actually, it's a bit of a coup to get Claire Burton to come along and listen directly to families. It's a great opportunity, so please take advantage of that. Jill, back to you. We'll have just a couple of minutes, and then we'll draw this to a close.
These are mixtures of questions and comments, and am I right in thinking that those children with current EHCPs who are in year 2 or above will not be affected?
No, not quite right. What they've said is if the child is in year 3 at the time these reforms go through, and the child is in special school, then you will be able to stay in a special school to the end of your education. That doesn't mean you won't be affected by this, because at the next transition point, whether it's from, as I say, infants to juniors, juniors to secondary, secondary to post-16, then the actual provision, you will be moved on to one of the new types of EHCPs, whatever they look like. Your child will have an individual support plan, and the provision will be written into the ISP instead of the EHCP. So there will absolutely be changes. There'll be changes in processes in terms of what's getting reviewed annually. And it will be that children at the next key transition point will transition across to the new system. So whilst you'll have the right to stay in that special school, there will still be changes for those children.
Okay, and what happens if funding of a specific school is covered in the EHCP, but then they move to a secondary school? Do the reforms make it harder to secure funding for a similar school at secondary level?
Hard to say, I would say, based on what we know, because the specialist provision packages haven't yet been written. The expert panel, they're just starting to recruit that expert panel now. So they're already thinking about writing these specialist provision packages and the national inclusion standards before the consultation has finished and before there's new legislation in place, because obviously they have to be prepared should it go through. So at the moment we're lacking a lot of detail, and I would say until we see a bill going through, there's still quite a lot of unanswered questions, and I would say this is one. I don't know, Philippa, if you've got any thoughts on this.
I was just going to chip in really. I'm just not persuaded that the government understands the complexity of what they're setting out to describe in these specialist packages, because this has got to be, it's got to allow for children of all ages, it across all the different packages, children in early years, in primary, in secondary, in FE. These packages are going to be so vast and complex. I'm not sure. And then I noticed there are some there are degrees of complexity as well. There's significant and complex and another expression. So there are kind of different levels of complexity right across the age range, across all those different settings, and across all the different areas of provision. 7 packages are proposed. We've got 5 areas of development, 7 packages proposed. It's really quite difficult to imagine. And there are some real challenges there because one of the packages about visual and hearing impairment talks about within the specialist package, there would be a requirement to have access to specialist HIVI teachers. Well, most of that is done without an EHCP now. For children now, that's done without an EHCP. So actually, it's suggesting that there'd be a lot more children swept into the packages and therefore an EHCP than we currently have. So I'm not sure that it's been thought through. And certainly the bits of information in the draft document that accompanies the consultation is just doesn't seem to be. I mean, I would have said it was not adequate to publish something like that. It's supposed to show us how they're going to meet this really very wide range of scenarios that need to be able to cover. It doesn't persuade me that actually there is a good understanding of what's going to be required of those packages.
Don't you think that was the problem in 2014? I think when the Code of Practice out, I can remember thinking then, this is such a lot of stuff. Does the government understand the complexity of the system to really understand how this is going to be implemented? And, we are where we are. And you're right.
My deepest wish is that we should adopt a different approach to this line, the height of the tide, and that should be collaborative. It should be through the existing requirements, which are not widely promoted, that requirement in the local offer to set out what the local authority expects to be available in the local schools. And where local authorities have done that collaboratively involving parents, teachers, wide range of services, they've really got to a much more constructive place about how to meet children's needs. It's much more collaborative to say, look, there are lots of things that we can do to support your child. We're trying this, but that doesn't seem to be working. Can you think, is there a reason why should we try something else? And you get that more creative, collaborative approach to meeting children's needs rather than the adversarial, what are you doing to meet my child's needs? And schools saying, well, we can't meet your child's needs. We need to go to the local authority for an EHC plan. It changes the conversation. And that's what I think we so desperately need.
Absolutely.
So why isn't that being promoted? That's my point.
Yeah. I agree. No, I completely agree. Sorry, I just got distracted by the question. So Debbie has very helpfully put a sort of signposting so that you can find the school's white paper on our website. She said if you go to the website, click on our work, then campaigning, then you'll find that page. Thank you, Debbie. And Natalie has asked, could she have a conversation with you, Linda? Because she thinks that you could offer her some much needed advice. So I don't know if you want to.
If I click on type answer and put my email in, will that work?
Yeah, absolutely. That would be great. Thank you. I'm just going to share one more slide very, very quickly. So bear with me while I do that. So this event has been put on for you this evening free of charge, but obviously the work the DSA does is not. It costs us money to put these things on. We are delighted that Linda and Philippa both gave up their evenings for free to come and do this. But we wondered if any of you are able to donate to the DSA to continue to support our work. We are doing and have been doing a lot of lobbying behind the scenes and talking to other organisations in the sector, really doing a sort of very detailed reading of these proposals to understand as well what the implications are for learners who have Down syndrome. And we're continuing to do that, as I've said, throughout this consultation period, and we will be putting on several events, but we will continue then afterwards to be briefing MPs and continuing to lobby to make sure that any reforms that go through are not to the detriment of learners who have Down syndrome. We will do our absolute utmost best to try and deliver that for you. So if you are able to support our work, we would be very grateful. And I've just put a link here and also a QR code, which I will just leave up for 1 minute and then just see if there are any other questions. I'm very aware we've run over slightly. So again, Linda and Philippa, thank you for sticking with us slightly later than we said that we would be. So I'll just keep an eye on the Q&A. And then we
just
may
to chip in, Sharon, just really delighted to join you, and I do hope it may help people to formulate their responses. So much in the documents, and I think your sort of summary is really helpful. But I would really just add my voice to yours, encourage people to send in comments if they possibly can, individually and as a group if you're able to. I think it would be brilliant.
Absolutely. And if there is anything at all that the Down Syndrome Association can do to help, or if you have got any questions about the SEND consultation document, if you contact us, so I'll put my email, I can't put my email address in here, but it's policy@downs-syndrome.org.uk. You can contact me anytime. And we will do everything we can to help and support you. And as I say, we do have several other events that we are running as well as those focus groups. We're putting on a twilight session for professionals. So if there's any teachers, anybody working in health or social care that you think might want to come along and find out more about the reforms, then please tell them about that. And then there will be the final event, which will be about actually how do you tackle consultations and how can you shape questions, and maybe how do you use that question 39 box to get your point across. We are also possibly having another webinar with IPSI looking at the legal implications, but they have had huge demand and lots of people have been wanting IPSI to come and present. So we're just waiting to see if there will be a date for them to come along. And if there is, it'll be again promoted on our social media channels, our newsletters, and on that school's white paper page. Now I'm going to stop sharing. I just want to check that okay, there's no more questions. There's just people saying thank you. So I would like to pass my thanks to Jill for doing the admin behind the scenes, the technical support, and really helping me get this event set up this evening. But particularly, I'd like to thank Linda and Philippa for your expertise, your insights, and your support this evening as well. So I think we'll probably draw the event to a close and say thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.